In the late 1850s, Sven Parker Hollengren came to the United States. His intention was to come to California and mine for gold. I don't know what happened to the gold idea, but he ended up in Geyserville in 1866. His main goal was to raise sheep, but he had an interest in wine for some reason. And he started planting grapes, and there's records of him paying tax in 1880, and for Zinfandel grapes specifically.
So Eduardo immigrated to Sonoma County in 1886 at the request of his good buddy Pietro Rossi, who had immigrated to Sonoma County a few years earlier and was essentially running Italian Swiss Colony, which was a co-op established in 1881 to provide housing and work for all the immigrants that came to America. So Eduardo and Angela met and they got married shortly after. That was in 1893. In 1895, they left Italian Swiss Colony and migrated 3 miles down the road, and in 1895 purchased our home ranch property. So that was $200 an acre at that time, which was, I learned, it was a lot of money at that point in time. But that was the beginnings of our family business.
My great-grandfather settled in Upper Dry Creek, close to where Lake Sonoma is. He had a sheep ranch and he was a farmer, and this was in the 1890s. His family came to the United States in 1865 from Switzerland, and then my grandfather settled on this ranch with his wife, Ruby, and built a house right here in 1927. My grandparents were farmers. They had prunes down in the flat part of the valley where the Dry Creek is, and grapes up here on the bench.
My family came to the north end of Dry Creek Valley here around 1910 from Mendocino County. They moved to Dry Creek over here on the hill across the creek at the north end. My dad was the first one born in Dry Creek, and they only owned up on the hill at that point grapes and apples and cherries. But they raised all their own, supplies, pigs, and they farmed with horses, all dry farmed on the hill.
My great-grandmother started sourcing grapes from the Dry Creek Valley, which was the Hillsburg area back then, in 1911, and started making wine, but they were living in San Francisco. And it wasn't until 1920 that they bought their first property and moved into Hillsburg.
I grew up with my grandparents, and they were, basically the immigrants that came over, and they're the ones that showed us how to mushroom hunt, and we tagged along. They're the ones that, showed us how to raise rabbits and animals on the farm and how to care for vineyards.
When my father came in 1927, which was during Prohibition time, so there was no commercial production going on, but the vineyards were here, and he farmed the vineyards, and you could legally sell grapes to home winemakers. So that's how he survived, or the family survived during that time.
The growers in Dry Creek always thought we had better grapes in the other regions, and I think home winemakers proved it. When those home winemakers wanted to make wine down in the Bay Area, they sought out Dry Creek first.
Gene Cuneo would tell the stories of during the Depression, how all the families would get together, and they may not have, everybody was kind of in the same boat, and they may not have a lot of money, but they all had food that they grew, and they had cows and chickens, and they had everything they needed, and they got together socially a lot.
If there was 12 people eating, the history of that table would dictate, how much pasta they made, how many crabs they bought for the cioppino, or you know, how much meat they would order, down to the ounce, because when it was done, and there was no waste.
They'd play bocce and drink wine and tell stories, and the kids would run around and play.
And the Italians at that time had big meals on weekends, usually Sunday afternoon. And my dad just would sneak off and go to one of the Italian families and play baseball, and of course get invited in for dinner. It was a highlight.
When the train would stop and a gentleman would get off in a business suit, they knew that was a wine buyer. And so she would always send the hired hand out to go get a chicken, and by the time he made it from the station to the house or to the winery, there was already a chicken frying, and they were going to have a meal before they talked business and talked wine. That's one of those things that we still feel very is a very important lesson and kind of a rule to live by.
My grandmother was very strong in the business. She had a whiskey bottle by the back door with a shot glass on top of it, and if you, as a male, came to her house to do business, she put the shot glass on the washing machine, poured you a shot, you had a shot, she rinsed it out, put it back, and you came in and did business. And it was the lousiest, terrible, most nasty whiskey you ever seen in your life, but that was the deal.
The whole valley was prunes, and the valley floor was prunes from one end to the other. There were a few pears, a few grapes here and there. The biggest tourist event when I was a kid growing up was the Prune Blossom Tour. And they would bring literally 20 or 30 busloads of people that would drive the valley and Alexander Valley and tour during Prune Blossom time. Healdsburg is famous for delaying the start of school until the prune crop was in. Because if the prunes weren't in, the farmers all went into the school board and said, we got to have these people still out there. We're not done.
The benefit of grapes were the fact that they would grow on the hillsides, and much better than the prunes would. So the hillsides were planted with grapes, and the lower valley was always planted to the prune crop.
They had about 4 varieties, quite a bit of Carignan.
Mostly Zinfandel, Petit Syrah,
Some other rogue varieties, Malvasia.
and some Alicante was the other 4th variety.
And my dad grew a variety called Burger, high tons per acre, but just kind of poor wine.
Early on, it was like more of a bulk wine, and it was either red or white. And then we also used the terms, borrowed terms from Europe, like Burgundy or Chablis or Sauternes. So that was how it was known in those earlier times.
The Pedroncelli family been there longer than the Petersons. We all went to the same church, the same schools, everything. And so they said, yeah, Zinfandel looks good. So my dad sold to Pedroncelli for several years, and they were making pretty much bulk wine.
That's when we really started to bottle a lot of our wines mostly into the 50s. Started developing a label, and it was in larger sizes too, usually gallon jugs.
Father always sold to Gallo, and I continued that. And Gallo didn't ever offer contracts until, I guess, into the 80s sometime. So we didn't even know, when we would deliver our grapes, we didn't even know what we were getting for them. You just took them in, and they give you a weight slip, and at the end of the season, they would send you a check, and that's when you knew how much you got for them.
I can remember overhearing conversations when I was a kid about, you deliver grapes to a winery, and you'd get there, and when the winery decided they had enough grapes, all of a sudden you weren't, going into a program, you were just mixed black grapes, and you dropped the price significantly. You had no notice until you were sitting on the scale at the winery, and then, sorry.
Really, it wasn't until the 60s and really the Paris tastings in the 70s that killed the fruit crop industry, and grapes took over.
When people started putting wine in a 5th bottle, and got it out of the gallon jugs, I think that's when you had people come in and start tasting.
first winery that was built in this valley after Prohibition really was Dry Creek, when David Stair came in.
Who's this kid from Boston who wants to come here and start a winery?
Dave Stair was kind of new at the business. I'm not sure what he did before, but he came into the area and built a winery and used our prices and bought fruit out of Dry Creek. That was a really big deal for the folks in this area, because this was somebody that was actually putting the local fruit into a bottle that got sold.
When I arrived in the scene in '72, Petronchelli's were the only resident winery with real, with people, and they became good friends, and they were kind of my icons, I guess.
I remember meeting Dave in the early '70s, coming in, and he spent time around and visited and was learning the business and learning the grape growing. He added something to the area and brought some new growth, which was kind of refreshing.
We didn't have a tasting room, so we would, I remember people, they walked down in the lower cellar, down some rickety steps into this cavernous area where their chiller was. It was as funky as anything, but people loved it because they were down the depths of the cellar. So that was our first exposure to the customer base. Then it took us a while to get a tasting room, and I'll never forget the early days of tasting room. We were just shocked that anybody'd pull up, park their car and drive and walk to our so we actually greet them. My dad would greet people just come to taste wine. Like, wow, you guys are amazing. What are you doing here? So it took us a while to grasp that concept that people just want to come here to taste wine.
Usually there wasn't any real wine glasses. It was usually the jelly glass. I think we used to call it Italian crystal, was because it was just an old jar.
So it was the mid-'70s that Sunset Magazine started printing tourism guides for the wine country, and Sonoma County was one of the hot spots.
We produced a wine sometime in the early '80s, a Dry Creek Valley Zinfandel, but we didn't say Sonoma County. And I printed the labels up. The BATF disapproved the label, saying it's not an approved appellation. And then I said that, well, we've already printed the labels, and they said, okay, you can get a use-up on that label, but you can't reprint it without getting the appellation established. So that's when the wheels began to churn towards getting the Dry Creek Valley established as an appellation.
I believe that meeting was at Lou Preston's. We sat around a table and started drawing lines, and Dry Creek was very easy because the watershed is such a unique little valley that it was very easy to footprint.
I grew up literally in this winery. I remember from my childhood years playing in the corner of the cellar with my Barbies. When I was a little older, 12, 13 years old, I would answer the phones. I worked in the tasting room, although I probably shouldn't have. I never poured wine, but I would wipe the counters. And then when I was in my teen years, I worked on the bottling line. So for me, growing up, Dry Creek meant the winery was just my whole world.
My buddy and I would help shovel stems and clean out bins while we play with our G.I. Joes.
A lot of the kids in the valley, back in the 80s, dirt bikes and BMX and Univegas were big, so we were always, biking around through the creek and such.
We got to fish Dry Creek. Dry Creek is probably the coldest body of water that I have ever been in. Comes out of the bottom of that lake at 39 degrees, and eventually you just lose feeling in your legs.
We basically spent every free moment that we weren't in school or playing sports, working in the vineyards.
I worked on the bottling line when my grandpa was doing it all by hand upstairs, and I remember marking boxes in the vineyard at harvest time. So learning to drive tractor at a very young age.
Growing up, Dry Creek was that. Being here, tasting the wine, out in the vineyard picking the grapes, pretending that we were making wine. I remember I had a little play set, and when the harvest was going on down in the yard, we were up in the house squeezing. I'm sure it was a gross, sticky mess, but we would just try to make our own wine and just kind of mimic the whole process.
Winemaking went from a general, it's drinkable, it's a jug wine, very palatable, to a specific label with a variety and a clone and all of this talk on the back label, you might say, was a big change. And that's when the winemaker said, we'll pay you that price, but you're gonna grow them the way I want them grown.
Our philosophy is very simple, that we want to express the place and the date on the bottle. That's it. And if that place happens to be something as broad as Dry Creek Valley, where we're sourcing fruit from multiple vineyards, we want to give the customer the absolute best expression of Dry Creek Valley. And if that place happens to be as specific as one of the many single vineyard wines that we make, then that's what we want to do. We want to express that tiny little slice of earth in the bottle.
You even have little mini appellations within the appellation itself. So as we've grown grapes over the years, I think we've all found these very specific areas that grow the very best Zinfandel, the very best Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc. It is proved in the glass. When you taste a glass of Dry Creek Valley wine, you have the best quality there, and you have all that perseverance for all those years is basically proof is in the taste of a Dry Creek Valley wine.
The stakes are higher now. It's such an expensive industry, and land values are so expensive, and you really can't afford to make a mistake. And I do sometimes feel like it limits, innovation and risk-taking. There are also a lot of wineries and labels and brands. They're owned by these big companies. They're just sort of fictitious wine brands. They're made-up names. It's bulk wine put in a pretty label, i.e. a virtual winery, and the consumer doesn't know the difference.
There's more degreed winemakers out there. There's more facilities that make it streamline it, the way to produce a bottle of wine and to also purchase it. I guess we're going back and forth on how much to be progressive or be old-fashioned, and what is the most comfortable for us and what is most attractive for the people wanting to find us and be involved with what we're doing.
I hope that the highest and best use of Dry Creek Valley continues to be farming and doesn't turn into more homes and kind of a glorified landscape.
When I started farming 20 years ago on my own, I spent 80% of my time in the vineyard and 20%, if that, in the office, and that's flipped, if not worse.
Government regulations. This property's been farmed for well over 100 years. When the vines got old, you'd take them out, take out a block and replant them. Now you've got to spend a couple $1,000s, go down to the county and get a permit to do something you've been doing for 100 years.
Anybody can make one bottle and sell it. They got to come back and buy the second one, the third one, and then you start to build a reputation for Dry Creek Valley.
And thank you to our ancestors. I mean, if it weren't for them, we wouldn't even be here.
Having that opportunity to kick the same dirt clods that my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather have all kicked, I mean, it's a pretty unique opportunity to have.
I deal with Napa wineries, and I got a friend that's over there that he always says, don't you know there's only two flavors, vanilla and chocolate, which he means Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon. And that's one of the real pluses in Dry Creek, is that you have the diversity.
We were taking risks. We were planting certain varietals in certain areas, and we didn't always know if it was the right area, but over time we figured it out. And I think that's probably the greatest accomplishment, is figuring out what the Dry Creek Valley as a region excels at from a varietal standpoint and from a winemaking standpoint.
You're so appreciative that you're here, you have a footprint here, you have some history you can remember, and it's going in the right direction.
It's fun to share that history, but it's also a motivating factor if you can see that fifth generation want to carry on the traditions.
It's not easy just making it off the land year after year and turning it around. And that's pretty neat. And I see, you know, I'm not concerned about down the road with my children because I can see that they get it. And I don't think they need the lecture that my grandmother gave to me because I think they're off and running already, and that's pretty neat.